pause for a few seconds and observe the world around you. The people, the objects, the screens, the opinions, the certainties repeated every day. Now ask yourself a question that almost no one has the courage to truly face: what if all of this is not the true reality? What if what we call real life is only a superficial layer, an organized appearance, an incomplete version of something far deeper? Plato did not write to comfort anyone. He wrote to provoke, to disturb, to pull human beings out of their intellectual comfort zone. His philosophy is neither gentle nor welcoming. It is a direct shock against the way we live, think, and accept the world. Plato perceives something fundamental that most people ignore: we confuse perception with truth. We believe that what we see, touch, and feel is real simply because our senses present it that way. But the senses are unstable. The same object changes depending on the light, the distance, or the angle. The same situation generates opposite interpretations depending on who observes it. What seems beautiful today may seem banal tomorrow. What seems just today may seem absurd tomorrow. Plato therefore formulates a devastating insight: if something is constantly changing, it cannot be the foundation of truth. Truth must be stable, universal, and independent of the fluctuations of the physical world. From this problem, Plato proposes one of the most radical ideas in the history of human thought. He claims that there must be a reality superior to the material world, a deeper layer of being that does not depend on the body or the senses. This reality is not accessed through the eyes or the hands, but through reason. This is what he calls the world of ideas. It is not a physical place, nor a mystical space with human forms or supernatural entities. It is an ontological dimension, the fundamental structure of reality, where the pure essences of everything we know exist. In the world of ideas there are no individual objects, but eternal essences. There is no specific chair, there is the idea of chair. There is no isolated just act, there is the idea of justice. Everything we see in the physical world is an imperfect copy, a shadow, a distant reflection of these essences. The material world is born, transforms, wears out, and dies. The world of ideas is not born, does not decay, and does not disappear. That is why Plato states that the physical world is secondary. It is not false, but it is incomplete. At the top of this invisible reality is what Plato considers the ultimate principle of everything: the idea of the good. It is not merely a moral notion. It is the source of intelligibility, that which makes all other ideas comprehensible. Just as the sun allows the eyes to see objects, the idea of the good allows the mind to understand reality. Without it, there is no truth, no justice, and no meaning. Plato reaches a bold conclusion: whoever does not understand the good lives intellectually blind, even if they see perfectly with their eyes. It is in this context that the famous allegory of the cave emerges, which should not be understood as a simple symbolic story, but as a profound diagnosis of the human condition. The cave is not a physical place, it is a mental state. The prisoners represent all those who live trapped by ready-made opinions, appearances, social conventions, and repeated narratives. The shadows are not obvious lies, but comfortable half-truths, discourses accepted without reflection. They seem real because they are all the prisoners have ever known. When one of these prisoners breaks free and leaves the cave, he does not find immediate pleasure. He finds pain, confusion, and discomfort. The light hurts eyes accustomed to darkness. Truth disorganizes everything that once seemed secure. Plato makes one thing very clear: awakening is not pleasant. Seeing the truth hurts. And when this individual returns to the cave to try to warn the others, he is not celebrated. He is ridiculed, discredited, and rejected. Because those who live among shadows do not hate the lie, they hate whoever threatens their comfort. Plato believed that this distancing from truth is not only social, but also existential. For him, the human soul does not begin in the body nor end with it. The soul has already had contact with the world of ideas, but upon binding itself to the body, it forgot what it contemplated. That is why Plato claims that learning is not acquiring something new, but remembering what was forgotten. This process is called anamnesis. Certain truths feel familiar because the soul recognizes them. Philosophy, then, is not the accumulation of information, but the awakening of the deep memory of essence. This view makes philosophy extremely dangerous to power. Plato realized that societies are not governed by truth, but by organized shadows. Narratives, symbols, and appearances sustain political and social structures. That is why he argued that rulers should be philosophers, or that philosophers should rule. Not out of elitism, but out of necessity. Those who do not know the truth govern through interest, fear, and manipulation. For Plato, ignorance in power is more destructive than conscious tyranny. When we look at Stoicism, we see that although it disagrees with Plato in many aspects, it shares a common core. Plato claims that truth lies beyond the physical world. The Stoics claim that truth lies in the reason that governs the world itself. But both agree that the senses deceive, that reason liberates, and that most people live deluded. The Platonist seeks to elevate the soul above appearances. The Stoic seeks to align the mind with the rational order of reality. Both seek the same thing, inner freedom. If Plato were alive today, he would recognize the cave immediately. The shadows are now algorithms, trends, instant discourses, and excess information. The chains are not made of iron, but of dopamine, fear of exclusion, and the need for validation. The fire that projects the shadows is the incessant flow of stimuli. The question he would ask us today is simple and brutal: do you think for yourself, or do you merely consume ready-made thoughts? Plato never promised happiness. He promised clarity. And clarity demands a high price. Those who see the truth lose illusions, break easy forms of belonging, and assume responsibility. But they gain something rare, not being easily deceived. Plato's philosophy does not create followers. It creates the awakened. And in the end, the choice is not philosophical, it is existential. Do you prefer the comfort of the shadows or the weight of truth? Because the two cannot coexist in the same space. There is a point in Plato that is almost never explored with due seriousness. He was not merely describing a theory about reality, he was accusing human beings of living below their own ontological potential. For Plato, the problem is not only that we see shadows, but that we adapt to them, build identity, pride, and meaning upon what is fragile and transient. This creates an intellectually complacent, emotionally reactive, and spiritually superficial humanity, even when it considers itself sophisticated. Plato realized that the greatest prison is not external. It is internal. It is dependence on what is immediate, visible, and socially validated. Human beings begin to measure value by recognition, truth by consensus, and happiness by momentary pleasure. This movement, for Plato, represents a complete inversion of the natural order. The soul, which should govern the body and guide life through reason, becomes governed by desires, impulses, and images. The result is a disordered existence, even when it appears successful. That is why Plato insists so strongly on the education of the soul. But not education in a technical or professional sense. He speaks of paideia, a profound formation of character and intelligence. To educate, for Plato, is to turn the soul in the right direction. It is not to pour in information, but to orient the inner gaze. A poorly oriented soul can accumulate knowledge and still remain blind. A well-oriented soul can perceive truth even with few external resources. This act of turning the soul is slow, painful, and solitary. Plato knew that no one can be dragged out of a cave by force. At most, enough discomfort can be provoked for the individual to question what they have always accepted as normal. That is why philosophy disturbs. It does not offer ready-made answers, it dismantles certainties. And human beings, in general, prefer psychological security to ontological truth. Plato also understood that there is an inevitable conflict between truth and popularity. What is true is rarely simple, and what is simple is rarely true. The masses orient themselves by what is easy to understand, quick to consume, and emotionally comfortable. Truth, on the other hand, demands silence, patience, and intellectual effort. That is why the philosopher is almost never heard while alive. His function is not to please the present, but to challenge the future. At this point, Plato distances himself completely from the modern idea of opinion. For him, opinion is not an acceptable middle ground between ignorance and knowledge. Opinion is an unstable state, based on appearances and capable of changing at any moment. True knowledge, by contrast, is firm, structured, and resistant to external pressures. A society that values opinions above truth is condemned to emotional oscillation and inconsistent decisions, even when it believes itself to be democratic. Plato saw this clearly as he observed Athenian politics. He saw how well-crafted speeches, empty of truth, were enough to convince crowds. He saw how charismatic but intellectually unprepared leaders led disastrous collective decisions. This led him to an uncomfortable conclusion: without philosophy, freedom turns into chaos. Without truth, choice becomes mere collective emotional reaction. It is important to understand that Plato did not despise the physical world. He did not preach an escape from reality, but a hierarchy of reality. The sensible world has its place, but it cannot occupy the top. When it does, everything is inverted. Pleasure begins to command reason. Fear begins to govern decisions. Appearance becomes more valuable than essence. Life turns into a sequence of stimuli, not a path with direction. At this point, Plato comes dangerously close to modern psychology. He realizes that a disordered soul lives in constant internal conflict. It desires what harms it, rejects what strengthens it, and confuses momentary satisfaction with fulfillment. Philosophy emerges as a kind of deep therapy, not to relieve symptoms, but to reorganize the individual's internal structure. It is not about feeling better, but about being better oriented. When the soul begins to align with truth, something silent happens. The person becomes less dependent on external validation. The noise of the world loses strength. Other people's opinions cease to be a compass. This does not generate arrogance, but firmness. The individual does not become cold, but stable. Plato believed that this stability is the sign that the soul has begun to approach the correct order of being. It is precisely here that Plato touches something Stoicism would later deepen: inner independence. While the Stoic speaks of mastery over passions, Plato speaks of the governance of the soul by reason. The principle is the same: whoever does not govern themselves will always be governed by something external. It may be a person, an ideology, a desire, or a fear. Slavery, for Plato, does not begin in the body, but in the mind. Plato also understood that not everyone is prepared for this path. And this is not a moral judgment, but a structural observation. Not every soul wishes to leave the cave. Some feel too comfortable in the shadows. Others fear the responsibility that truth brings. Because seeing reality as it is implies taking responsibility for oneself, and that is more frightening than illusion. That is why philosophy has never been, and never will be, a mass movement. It was not made to please, to go viral, or to entertain. It was made for those who feel a persistent discomfort, a sense that something does not fit, even when everything seems to be going well. Plato wrote for this kind of person. For those who sense that there is something beyond the visible, beyond the immediate, beyond the superficial. At bottom, Plato forces us to face a difficult truth: living well is not the same as living correctly. It is possible to have comfort and be completely lost. It is possible to have success and be far from essence. Philosophy does not promise external rewards. It promises internal alignment. And this alignment changes the way everything is experienced, even if nothing changes externally. If Plato were standing before us now, he would not ask about beliefs, religion, or ideology. He would ask a much simpler and much harder question to answer: what governs your life? The senses? Opinions? Fear? Desire? Or reason guided by truth? Because for Plato, this answer defines not only how you live, but at what level of reality you exist. And it is exactly here that the text could end, but it should not. Because Plato did not write to be admired, but to be continued. The cave is not an ancient myth. It renews itself in every generation, with new shadows and new chains. The only thing that remains the same is the silent choice that each individual must make, often alone, far from applause and easy certainties. Philosophy begins when someone decides not to be satisfied with what seems obvious. When the mind refuses to accept that this is all there is. When the soul feels it was born for something higher than merely reacting to the world. Plato does not call this a gift or a privilege. He calls it responsibility. Because once the truth begins to be seen, there is no longer a comfortable return to the shadows. There is a decisive point in Platonic thought that rarely receives attention. Truth, when finally perceived, does not immediately change the world, but it irrevocably changes the one who perceives it. Plato understood that awakening is not an external event, but a silent transformation in the inner structure of the soul. After this, the individual continues to live in the same world, dealing with the same people and facing the same problems, yet no longer fully belongs to that plane of reality. He comes to inhabit an intermediate space, where he sees the world operating through illusions, but can no longer deceive himself with them. This condition creates a specific kind of solitude that Plato knew well. It is not social isolation, but ontological misalignment. The philosopher realizes that many conversations move in circles, that many disputes are not about truth but about ego, and that many certainties are sustained only by the fear of questioning. This does not make the philosopher superior, but displaced. He sees the mechanisms behind narratives and therefore can no longer surrender to them with innocence. Plato understood that this displacement can lead to two dangerous paths. The first is contempt for the world, the temptation to withdraw completely from practical life, treating the everyday as something inferior. The second is resentment, the frustration of realizing that truth is not valued. For this reason, he insists on the discipline of the soul. Seeing the truth does not authorize arrogance or escape. On the contrary, it demands responsibility. Those who see farther must learn to walk carefully among those who do not yet see. In this sense, Plato assigns a profound ethical role to the philosopher. He is not merely someone who contemplates abstract ideas, but someone who must act with measure, knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Not every truth needs to be spoken at every moment, and not every mind is prepared to hear it. The common mistake is to confuse lucidity with intellectual aggressiveness. Plato knew that truth, when poorly communicated, can generate more resistance than liberation. Another crucial point is that Plato did not believe access to truth was automatic or guaranteed. Intelligence, reading, or curiosity are not enough. The soul must be prepared. Disordered desires, excessive vanity, and attachment to status function as internal noise that obstructs clear contemplation. For this reason, Plato saw ethics as a precondition for knowledge. A soul dominated by impulses can hardly sustain a stable vision of truth. This idea directly confronts the modern mentality, which separates knowledge from character. Today it is believed that someone can understand the truth while living in a completely disordered way. Plato would strongly disagree. For him, the way one lives directly influences what one is capable of understanding. Truth is not merely something to be grasped, it is something one must be prepared for, or not. Plato also perceived that most people do not reject truth out of malice, but out of existential fatigue. Facing reality as it is requires energy, discipline, and renunciation. It is easier to accept simplified versions, ready-made narratives, and convenient explanations. Illusion persists not only because it deceives, but because it saves effort. This is the true power of the shadows, they are cognitively comfortable. When an individual begins to free himself from these shadows, something curious happens. He starts to realize that many of the anxieties he carried did not come from reality itself, but from the mistaken interpretations he imposed upon it. Truth does not eliminate suffering, but it eliminates much of the unnecessary suffering. Plato does not promise immediate emotional relief, but offers structural clarity, and this clarity reorganizes the experience of pain. At this point, Platonic philosophy begins to touch practical life directly. Decisions are made with less haste and less need for approval. The individual no longer reacts automatically to external stimuli, because he has learned to distinguish the essential from the accidental. This does not make him insensitive, but more stable. He suffers when it is necessary to suffer, but not because of illusions. Plato saw this state as a higher form of freedom. Not the freedom to do everything one desires, but the freedom not to be enslaved by desire. A soul guided by truth does not need to flee from the world, nor does it lose itself within it. It participates without dissolving. It observes without confusion. It acts without illusion. This is where Plato becomes particularly uncomfortable for the modern world. His philosophy suggests that many of our most celebrated goals, success, recognition, power, visibility, are secondary or even distracting when placed above truth. He does not say they are evil, but that they cannot occupy the center of life. When they do, the soul loses direction, even if it gains applause. Plato also understood that the philosophical path is not linear. There are relapses. There are moments of confusion. There are periods when the shadows once again seem convincing. This does not mean failure, but the human condition. The difference is that once the soul has seen, it never completely forgets. Even when distracted, something remains restless. Truth leaves a mark that does not fade. This restlessness, far from being a problem, is the engine of philosophy. It prevents total complacency. It is the sign that the soul is still in motion, still seeking alignment. Plato did not see this as useless suffering, but as creative tension. The living soul is one that neither closes itself within rigid certainties nor surrenders to chaos, but remains oriented toward the good, even without fully possessing it. For this reason, Plato never presented his philosophy as a closed system. The world of forms is not a catalogue of ready-made answers, but a direction. It points upward, not toward a manual. The common error is to turn Plato into doctrine, when he is, in truth, a permanent invitation to examine reality. At its core, Plato places before us a silent responsibility, to examine life before accepting it. Not to live by inertia, not to think by repetition, not to desire by imitation. This does not mean rejecting the world, but passing through it with awareness. Philosophy, in this sense, is not escape, but lucid presence. As this gaze deepens, something curious happens. The world does not lose meaning, but gains depth. Simple things become denser. Silence begins to teach. Time ceases to be mere urgency and becomes space. Plato believed this was the sign that the soul was beginning to align with the proper order of being. And perhaps this is the most subversive part of his entire philosophy, the idea that life can be lived with less noise, less anxiety, and less illusion, not because the world has changed, but because the gaze has changed. External reality remains imperfect, unstable, and often unjust. What changes is the way it is understood. Plato does not promise a grand finale, nor a definitive revelation. He promises something rarer, continuous lucidity. A state in which the soul is not easily deceived, does not sell itself cheaply, and does not lose itself in comfortable shadows. This does not make life easier, but it makes it more truthful. And in the end, perhaps Plato was saying something simple, though difficult to accept. The greatest difference between living in the shadows and living in the light is not in what is seen, but in what one no longer accepts as sufficient.